Virginia, 1829. The night pressed heavy over the plantation, broken only by the hiss of wind through cotton fields and the rasp of insects in the dark. Inside the wooden house, a master lay drunk in his bed, certain that the world bowed to his command. Yet as he drifted deeper into sleep, Charity, an enslaved woman reduced to nothing but a name in court records, stood at his bedside. No bells, no witnesses. Only a rope, a stifled breath, and history whispering awake. The records barely speak her name. A single word, Charity, etched in the brittle ink of an 1829 court document, is all that remains. No portrait, no letters, no lineage traced. Just a name, fragile as ash, surviving across centuries. She was born into silence, not the silence of peace, but the silence of negation, where one's cries or laughter were not acknowledged, where one's existence was measured only in labor. From the moment she opened her eyes, she belonged to someone else, a child of Virginia's soil, but not of Virginia's promise. A girl destined to live her life in service to a house that never called her family. In the cramped cabins that lined the edges of the fields, she learned early that words were dangerous. Enslaved children were taught obedience through absence of affection, absence of freedom, absence of choice. When others spoke her name, it was not to affirm her humanity, but to summon her body for work. Her hands scrubbed, carried, cooked, stitched, her back bent before she had reached womanhood. The world saw her as an object of labor. Yet, even within silence, a pulse beat. Enslaved women carried stories in their eyes, in the quiet gestures exchanged at dusk, in hymns whispered low so that the night itself seemed to listen. For Charity, this was her inheritance. Resilience masked as compliance, endurance disguised as invisibility. In that house, she moved like a ghost, a presence without acknowledgement. The master's children might recall the shape of a figure setting down a tray, or the faint smell of bread baking before dawn, but they would not remember her face. She was meant to blend into the background, to exist without existing. But ghosts, too, remember. Charity remembered each slight, each order, each day spent knowing that her life was never hers to claim. Memory settled in her bones like stones at the bottom of a river, heavy, pressing, yet shaping the current of her resolve. Her name, given by those who enslaved her, was meant as a token of submission, Charity, a word evoking humility and service. But in her silence, the meaning inverted. It became a cruel irony, a gift she was never granted, a mercy she was never shown. If history barely speaks her name, it is because her life was never meant to be recorded. But the silence that smothered her childhood did not erase her. It only carved deeper chambers within her, where unspoken grief and unacknowledged strength gathered like storm clouds, waiting. The house stood proud in the middle of the fields, its wooden frame painted white, its porch columns reaching upward like declarations of permanence. To the outside world, it was the mark of wealth, authority, and civilization. To Charity, it was a prison without stone or iron bars, guarded instead by law, custom, and the ever-present whip. The master who lived within considered himself lord of all he surveyed. His fields stretched wide, his barns filled with harvest. Yet his truest wealth lay not in land but in flesh, the men, women, and children whose lives were bartered as if they were cattle. He was a man accustomed to obedience, a man whose whims carried the force of law within the boundaries of his property. For him, the house was a stage of power. He dined at tables groaning with food while voices sang his praises. At night, his laughter mingled with the clink of glasses, echoing down the halls. Each sound of joy for him was built upon the unseen labors of those who had no voice. The aroma of roasted meat came from kitchens, where enslaved women worked until their hands blistered. The fire that warmed his chamber was stoked by men who slept cold on dirt floors. But for Charity, the house was more than walls and beams, it was a constant threat. Every creak of the floorboards at night carried the weight of dread. For enslaved women, bedrooms were not sanctuaries but hunting grounds. The master's sense of entitlement did not end with land or labor. He saw women like Charity not as human beings but as property to be used as he pleased. His gaze reduced her to an object of desire and dominion, and each night she lived with the knowledge that his footsteps might bring humiliation, violence, or worse. When the house fell silent at night, It was not peace that settled, but menace. The laughter from the dining hall might fade, but the memory of it clung to the walls like smoke. For every cheer he raised with his friends, there was a corresponding silence among those who served him, a silence born not of consent, but of survival. The house, to outsiders, looked like prosperity. To Charity, it was a constant reminder that she lived within a world that denied her humanity. She could move through its rooms, yet none of them belonged to her. She could cook the master's meals, yet never taste freedom. She could clean its corners until her hands bled, yet she herself was considered unclean in the eyes of the man who owned her. It was in this house, this polished cage, that her spirit endured years of quiet terror. And it was in this same house, one night in 1829, that terror would finally meet its reckoning. The years blurred together, measured not in seasons but in labor. Dawn was her summons, dusk her dismissal. From girlhood to womanhood, Charity's body became an instrument of survival for others, not herself. Her hands churned butter, lifted barrels, scrubbed floors until her knuckles cracked open. Her back bent beneath the cotton harvest, her skin scarred by the raw leather that snapped when the overseer judged her pace too slow. Humiliation was not a singular act but a daily ritual. It lurked in the way the mistress dismissed her presence, as if she were a shadow rather than a woman. It lingered in the master's drunken laugh, which often followed the sound of breaking glass or a slammed door. In the hierarchy of the plantation, even the children of the house bore authority over her, their small commands carrying the weight of a society that denied her dignity. The kitchen was her domain, yet never hers. Each pot she lifted, each plate she polished, was a reminder that her labor fed others while she endured hunger of her own. The master's table groaned with roasted meats and sugared delicacies, while behind the scenes, Charity and others swallowed cornmeal gruel, their bellies knotted by both hunger and rage. She bore the years like a tree carries rings, silent, unseen, but recording everything. Every slap of ridicule, every order barked, etched into her with permanence. Yet her silence was not submission. It was a sentence suspended in air, a verdict never spoken. As one enslaved man once muttered when no white ear could hear, "Silence is the loudest scream we have left." Among the enslaved community, Charity's resilience was noticed, though never named aloud. Around the fire at night, when hymns rose softly into the darkness, her presence was like a stone in the riverbed, solid, enduring, shaping currents without drawing attention. Children clung to her skirts, sensing safety. Women drew strength from her calm, even as they shared the same exhaustion. Still, no amount of shared strength could erase the fact the house remained a fortress of domination. Each year, Charity's body aged faster than it should have, ground down by labor, shadowed by the ever-present threat of violation. To the master, her silence proved obedience. To Charity, it was the opposite. It was the gathering of storms. With every year, the unspoken pressed harder against her ribs, filling her lungs with something combustible. She was not only enduring chains of iron and rope, but chains of laughter, of mockery, of invisibility. Those years, though blurred, were not wasted. They became the prelude, the necessary silence, before a single night would ignite it all. It was Christmas Eve, 1829. The house glittered with false joy. Candles burned low in the master's chamber, their light wavering in drafts that slipped through wooden shutters. Downstairs, the remnants of a feast lingered, half-empty goblets, discarded bones, crumbs strewn across polished plates. Laughter had drained away into snores, the air thick with the musk of wine and tobacco. Charity stood apart from the revelry, moving through shadows. The night was hers in a way the day had never been. For once, her hands were not occupied with service. They were still, clenched around a length of rope she had taken from the pile used to bind kindling. It was rough, ordinary, unremarkable, yet in her palm, it felt alive, as though it carried centuries of unspoken resistance. She did not enter the master's chamber suddenly. She lingered outside first, listening. His snores were uneven, heavy with drink. She knew the rhythms of his body better than he realized, every stagger in his step, every slur in his speech, every breath when he drifted into stupor. Tonight, the pattern was different, deeper, slower, unguarded. For Charity, this was not a moment born in impulse. It was the culmination of years compressed into a single heartbeat. The rope in her hand was not a weapon she had chosen, but one given to her by circumstance. by necessity. Where others saw a tool for firewood, she saw the symbol of her own smothered fire. The house itself seemed to conspire with her. The floors creaked softly under her weight but did not betray her. The wind outside rattled the shutters like a drumbeat, urging her forward. The faint glow of the hearth cast her shadow across the wall, doubling her presence, as if her ancestors themselves stood beside her. In that charged silence, she stepped across the threshold. The chamber smelled of sweat and brandy, of arrogance and decay. The master's mouth hung open in sleep, his body sprawled, unaware. For once, he was vulnerable, stripped of the power that daylight restored to him. Charity's breath slowed, the rope tightened in her fist. The years of silence, the decades of suppression, had distilled into this fragile moment, one spark in the dark, waiting to be struck. And as the candlelight flickered, casting fleeting halos on the ceiling beams, Charity understood. What she was about to do was not an act of cruelty, but of reclamation. The silence of her life had led to this point, and the night itself seemed to lean closer, waiting for the strike that would break it. Time slowed into fragments. A candle sputtered. The wind moaned faintly through the cracks in the shutters. Somewhere in the house, a dog barked and then went silent again. Charity's world had narrowed to a single point. The bed, the rope in her hand, the breath of a man who had believed he was untouchable. Her heart pounded against her ribs, not with fear alone, but with the weight of years compressed into this fragile instant. The chamber felt smaller, airless, as if the walls themselves pressed inward. Each flicker of the candle painted shadows that swayed across the walls, bending like figures that bore witness. She stood there, breath shallow, and in that hesitation, the memories surged, the laughter that had followed her humiliation, the sting of the lash that bit into her back. The silence forced upon her whenever her dignity was denied. Each moment coiled inside her, until the pressure could no longer be contained. When the rope drew tight, it was not a spectacle. There was no violence shouted aloud, no chaos. Only the thudding of blood in her ears, the rasp of air being swallowed by darkness, and the frantic silence of a room where two lives collided, one ending, one transforming. The master's body convulsed, then weakened. The struggle was brief, muffled, swallowed by walls that had long absorbed cries like hers. The candlelight wavered, then steadied, as if acknowledging that the act was done. In that moment, Charity was not triumphant. There was no shout, no song of victory, only the heavy sound of her own breathing, filling the chamber once dominated by his presence. For the first time in her life, she stood in a room where silence did not mean submission, it meant conclusion. She released the rope, and the stillness spread outward, blanketing the house. The plantation slept on, unaware. Outside, the cotton fields swayed gently, indifferent to the human storm that had just broken. The night, so long her enemy, became her accomplice, sealing the act in darkness. The weight of years had funneled into a single heartbeat, and now the echo of it trembled through her limbs. She sank onto the floorboards, her body rigid with the enormity of what had just occurred. The air felt different, charged, almost metallic, as though history itself had shifted course inside that small room. No one saw her, no one heard. Yet in that suffocating silence, Charity had finally spoken. Outside the chamber, the world remained unchanged. The fire in the hearth downstairs had burned down to embers, casting a dim red glow across discarded plates. The master's guests, drunk from feast and wine, snored in distant rooms, blissfully unaware. Even the enslaved quarters lay silent. Exhausted bodies had collapsed into restless sleep, knowing dawn would summon them again. The house itself slept through the event. Its walls, so used to swallowing suffering, muffled the final breaths of its master as if nothing had happened. The same beams that had heard laughter, commands, and the crack of whips now bore silent witness to an inversion of power. Charity sat in the dark, rope still limp in her hands, staring at the body sprawled upon the bed. The enormity of the moment pressed down on her, but no tears came. She did not weep nor smile. The act had not been about joy. It was necessity, survival, perhaps inevitability. What could joy mean in a world that had denied her humanity? The night pressed forward. Hours passed, measured only by the soft ticking of a clock in the hallway. To anyone else, the house seemed unchanged, yet within its heart, a shift had occurred. A silence that once meant submission now meant absence. The absence of the master's dominance, his voice, his shadow. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. It sounded like a long, slow sigh, as though the night itself mourned or relieved itself of a burden. For once, the sound did not frighten Charity. It felt almost like acknowledgement. When she finally rose from the floorboards, her body was stiff, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the sheer weight of stillness. She placed the rope aside. The chamber smelled of brandy and candle smoke. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The rest of the house slept, unaware. The fields beyond stretched endless, the cottonheads glowing faintly in the moonlight, indifferent to human struggle. History itself seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for the morning to unveil what the night had concealed. Charity walked from the room without sound, her steps deliberate, her face unreadable. To those who would later judge her, she would remain a criminal, a transgressor. But in that moment, in the sleeping house, she was something else, a silence finally unbroken, a shadow that had spoken in the only language left to her. And still, the plantation slept, wrapped in the illusion that nothing had changed. Morning broke softly, as it always did. The first light stretched across the fields, painting rows of cotton in pale silver. Roosters crowed. The enslaved stirred from their cabins, bodies aching from labor, minds already bracing for another day. To them, it was simply the continuation of a cycle without end. But within the master's house, a different silence lingered. When the household awoke and found his chamber, the stillness became thunderous. There he lay, lifeless, sprawled on the same bed where he had once believed himself invulnerable. His face bore the unnatural stillness of one who had been torn from sleep by finality. The house erupted, voices shouted, servants rushed about in panic, their feet clattering against wooden floors. The mistress wailed, her cry breaking the dawn in shrill notes. Overseers, summoned from outside, stormed into the house, their boots pounding like war drums. Suspicion fell swiftly. Eyes turned, sharp and merciless, toward the enslaved. Whispers spread, who could have done this? Yet the question was less about evidence and more about certainty. In their minds, it could only have been one of those who had lived under his command. Who else would dare? Who else would bear reason? Fear gripped the enslaved community. For them, the master's death was not liberation, but a storm gathering overhead. Retribution was swift in such times, often indiscriminate, often cruel. Even those who had no knowledge of the act braced themselves for punishment, knowing how fragile their existence was before the wrath of white authority. Charity moved through the chaos as she had always done, silent, steady. She did not tremble or weep. Her face betrayed nothing. But silence itself can draw attention, and soon her composure marked her out. How could a woman so small, so quiet, be the cause of this thunder? And yet, in the eyes of her captors, the implausible became possible. The plantation quivered under the weight of accusation. Overseers prowled, their hands eager for the whip. Every enslaved person was questioned, threatened, scrutinized. Fear hung in the air thicker than the morning fog, and with each passing hour, whispers hardened into certainty. It was Charity. The name that had once existed only faintly in records now became the center of furious attention. She, who had lived her life like a shadow, was suddenly illuminated by suspicion's harsh glare. And so, discovery did not come through proof, but through the inevitability of a system that could never imagine her innocence. They bound her wrists and dragged her to a courthouse that smelled of damp wood and ink. The journey itself was short, but the weight of it was immeasurable. Charity, who had spent her life unseen, now became the focus of every eye, though never as a woman, only as a defendant. The trial was no true trial at all. It was performance, ritual, spectacle. The law, in theory blind, here stared directly at her with unmasked contempt. In the eyes of the court, she was not human. She was property gone awry, a possession turned threat. The charges were read swiftly, the words sharp as blades: murder, rebellion, insolence. The court did not linger on her years of labor, her years of violation, her years of silence. Those truths had no place in the script of justice, written by men who saw her only as a body that had overstepped its bounds. Witnesses were called, though they had seen nothing. Hearsay became evidence, suspicion became fact. No defense could be mounted, for the law allowed none for a black enslaved woman accused of such a crime. Her voice was not invited into the proceedings. When she tried to speak, her words were cut short, dismissed as irrelevant. Around her, the townsfolk filled the benches, their eyes burning with fascination and fury. Some whispered prayers for vengeance, others muttered disbelief. Could such a small woman truly have done it? Yet disbelief did not soften judgment, it hardened it. To them, her very defiance, her very survival, was proof enough. The judge delivered his sentence with the cold detachment of a man announcing the weather: execution. The gavel fell, not as punctuation, but as a seal on inevitability. Among the enslaved who heard whispers of the trial, the story spread differently. They called it not a crime, but a testimony, not a rebellion, but a declaration that even the most silenced could, for one night, speak. In their whispered retellings, Charity became less a woman than a symbol. Her act remembered not as violence, but as survival clawing through the dark. But symbols offered no shield to her flesh. The trial was done, her fate sealed. In the courtroom, the air was heavy, as though centuries of silence had conspired to suffocate her once more. Charity stood, wrists bound, her face solemn, her eyes steady. She had been stripped of defense, stripped of mercy, stripped of recognition as human. And yet, within her gaze, there lingered something that no court could extinguish: the quiet knowledge that, for one night, she had broken the silence that bound her life. The morning of her execution dawned with a clarity that felt merciless. The sky stretched wide and indifferent, its pale blue unbroken by clouds. For the enslaved who watched from a distance, the day carried the weight of prophecy. For the townsfolk who gathered eagerly, it was entertainment dressed as justice. They brought Charity to the place of execution with her wrists bound, her body small against the gallows that loomed above her. The wood creaked as though it, too, resented its role. The crowd pressed close, murmuring, some with anticipation, others with unease. In their eyes, she was not Charity. She was the embodiment of a fear they could not name, the fear that the silent might one day rise. Her face remained calm. She did not beg nor curse. She stood still, her breath even, her eyes scanning the horizon where fields stretched endlessly. Perhaps she thought of the years bent over cotton, of the laughter that had marked her humiliation, of the night when silence became her ally. Perhaps she thought of nothing at all. The officials recited their words: condemnation, duty, closure, but their voices were brittle against the immensity of the moment. For in the hush that followed, something else stirred, a murmur among the enslaved who had slipped into the edges of the crowd. Their voices did not rise loud enough to be noticed by the overseers, but soft enough to bind them together. They whispered her name, Charity, as though speaking a prayer, as though reclaiming her from the machinery of erasure. When the act was done, her body was denied dignity. No grave with a marker, no rites to sanctify her passing. She was cast aside, as if her life and her defiance could be buried in obscurity. But ashes do not vanish so easily. The wind carried fragments into the air, scattering them across fields that had borne her sweat. To the white record keepers, she was another criminal, erased by law. To the enslaved, she became something else, a memory threaded into songs sung under breath, a story whispered by firelight, a name kept alive by those who understood what silence could mean. Her execution was meant to restore order, yet it revealed something deeper. That order itself was fragile, that even in chains, a single woman could bend the silence of centuries into a moment of defiance. And though the gallows claimed her body, it could not claim the quiet revolution that her act ignited, one remembered not in monuments, but in whispers, carried by wind and time. Charity left no monument, no stone to bear her name, only a fragile line in a court record, and a night that history tried to forget. Yet, in that silence, she proved what generations have felt, that even the most oppressed hold within them a boundary, a breaking point. Her act forces us to ask, was the crime in her hands, or in the system that left her no choice but the rope? If stories like Charity's speak to you, subscribe to Murder Files Television, because some names, though nearly erased, still breathe when we say them aloud.